Hi, welcome back to your recap videos for the Christian practices. Today we're going to be focusing on what is the Holy Communion and why is it important for some Christians. The first thing I asked you to have a look at is what event is being shown here in this picture and why is it a significant event. Now of course this is a very famous painting of the Last Supper, which was the meal that Jesus and his disciples had just before he was crucified and ultimately resurrected and ascended. Now this is an incredibly important part of the Christian story, it's an incredibly important part of the Easter story, and it still has a massive impact upon Christians today. Which was the challenge task I asked to have a look at, and why might it still have an impact on Christians today? The simple answer for that is that Holy Communion, or the sacrament of the Eucharist, as it is more correctly referred to, is seen as either a reenactment of or an act done in memory of the Last Supper, and it helps for Christians to be close to Jesus. And we're going to have a look at how it is specifically important moving forward. 4 key words to have a look at today. Eucharist, which is of course the sacrament, remembering that a sacrament is any act, an outward sign of inward grace, or any act that allows, or any ritual, that allows access to the grace of God. Communion, which in this context we're talking about Holy Communion, communing with God. Salvation, being saved, the salvation, the saving from eternal death and access to eternal life that Jesus offers through his sacrifice on the cross. And transubstantiation, which is a specifically Catholic, with some sort of maybe Orthodox and some Anglican denominations believing in it. Transubstantiation is the idea, as we discussed in the sacraments video, that the bread and the wine used in the sacrament of the Eucharist physically transforms into the actual body and actual blood of Jesus Christ. Now this video is going to be a bit of a more in-depth look specifically at Holy Communion or the Eucharist. It's the last video we're going to be having a look at on sacraments. The only 2 sacraments that we've looked at in great detail are of course baptism and the Eucharist. If you're interested in learning about the other sacraments, I have created a video on all 7 sacraments, specifically focusing on the Catholic Church, but these 2 are the main 2 sacraments that are accepted by all parts of Christianity. So then, before we go any further, we need to know what is Holy Communion. Now there's a YouTube video here that I linked and we're watching the lesson. I will link it in the description below so you can have a look at it. It's particularly useful showing you a Christian's perspective, a young Christian's perspective, on the importance of Holy Communion for him and for his peers. So Holy Communion is the sacrament that uses bread and wine to celebrate the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and ultimately his resurrection from death. It is a service of thanksgiving, so it is a way for Christians to give thanks to Jesus, to God, for sacrificing himself to offer them the salvation and remove their sins. So for Catholics, the sacrifice of Jesus is made present again during this ritual and made real for believers. So the presence of Jesus is actually there at the Holy Communion or the Eucharist for Catholics. For the churches that do not consider Holy Communion a sacrament, it is still a significant ceremony. Many Christians consider it to be the most important act of worship. If you recall, or if you have watched the sacrament video, we focused on this being the key, the focus, the sort of nexus, the whole thing that the Christian faith revolves around. It recalls the Last Supper of Jesus, which is outlined, of course, in Matthew in his Gospels. There are various other names that you might have or might hear for Holy Communion or the Eucharist. I have some of them outlined here, so it could be called Eucharist, Holy Communion. It could simply be referred to as Mass, predominantly in the Catholic Church, breaking of the bread, the divine liturgy, or the Lord's Supper. Now, different denominations will refer to it as different things, but it is accurate to refer to all of them as the sacrament of the Eucharist. It is the sacrament of the Eucharist. It is Holy Communion. If you were to use any of these words to describe it, you would be accurate. It's just worthwhile knowing that there are some different ways some different terms people might use when discussing Holy Communion. Now I asked you to note down the different names and to discuss why Christians perform this ceremony. So it's really important for you to remember that it celebrates the sacrifice of Jesus and it gives thanks to Jesus for the salvation that is offered through his death. So, we spoke about how some Christians may have different interpretations of the Holy Communion. Whilst it is universal, and whilst it features in, well, almost without question, almost without exception, every Christian denomination, there are different ways it is interpreted, as would be expected with a religion that has sort of fragmented into so many denominations. There are obviously going to be different interpretations. So for Catholics, Orthodox Christians, who bear in mind consider themselves to be the true Catholic Church, and some Anglicans believe that the bread and wine physically become the body and blood of Christ. Now, of course, it's a divine mystery how this happens, but they believe that Jesus is fully present in the bread and wine. And by receiving Holy Communion, they believe that they become present in a mystical way at the death and resurrection of Christ, which saves them from their sins. So, Catholics, predominantly, Orthodox Christians and some Anglicans, believe that by receiving the Holy Communion, they are physically present at the death and the resurrection of Christ. So they are first-hand witnesses to his death and to his resurrection. So this is incredibly important for these Christians, as they believe it gives them direct access to the salvation offered by God, by the grace and the undeserved love that God has for all humans. It gives them direct access to this grace. This is why it's a sacrament. They gain access to grace. Protestant Christians, on the other hand, who choose to celebrate the Holy Communion, do so as a reminder of Jesus' words and actions at the Last Supper. The bread and wine, while still being important, are symbols of Jesus' sacrifice and help them to reflect on the meaning of Jesus' death and the resurrection for their lives today. They do not believe that it physically becomes the blood and body of Jesus. For them it is a symbolic thing, it represents Jesus, and it helps them to remember the sacrifice. However, they are not mystically transported to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. It's a far more symbolic thing rather than a mystical transubstantiation event where the bread and wine physically become different things. So as we said before, you can see that there are some very different interpretations of the Holy Communion. However, it is really important that you remember that it is massively important to most Christians, and it is very often referred to as the sort of focus point and the core of the Christian faith. This is one of the most important practices within the Christian faith, which is very useful for you when being asked to explain whether or not certain sacraments or certain practices are the most important. Very often you could make the argument, and quite convincingly, that the Holy Communion is the most important thing that Christians do. More important than baptism, more important than marriage, more important than holy orders, or more important than charity work or something. The kind of thing that you might be asked in a 12-mark question, or it might be something that you might be asked in a lower marked question, but it's really, really, really useful to remember that Holy Communion is so, so, so important, specifically to Catholics, Orthodox Christians and some Anglicans. Whilst it is still important to Protestant Christians, it doesn't quite have the same weight, as it's not giving them first-hand experience of the death and resurrection of Christ. So then, how does Holy Communion impact the Christian community? It does so in a variety of ways, but we've got some little suggestions here that we'll have a look through. So, the first thing it does is it brings the community of believers together in unity, strengthening their commitment to their faith. If someone is having doubts or going through a difficult time, celebrating Holy Communion with others can give them support or encouragement. So this aspect of bringing the community together is something that most, if not all, Christians do, and it can help bring together and bind together the community, the wider Christian community. Holy Communion is at the centre of many Christians' lives. They believe that they receive God's grace by joining in the great sacrifice of Jesus. Receiving the love of God, receiving the grace of God is fundamental to Christian beliefs, and therefore is at the centre of many Christians' lives, as they believe that by doing so, by taking part in the Holy Communion, by taking part in the sacrament of the Eucharist, they gain direct access to this grace and love of God. And of course, it also reminds Christians that while they are breaking bread together, there are many in the world that are starving. Holy Communion encourages them to work for equality and justice for all. Many churches collect money during the service to support work being done. So it's a reminder that yes, whilst they're sharing in this meal, there are many other people around the world, Christian and non-Christian, who may not be in such a fortunate circumstance and may be themselves starving. So it can help to remind Christians of their duty to help others and to work for a better world. So there is a small pattern in the way that most churches celebrate the Holy Communion. First things first, there'll be the ministry of the Word, which focuses on God's Word in the Bible, and then there's the ministry of Holy Communion, offering, consecrating and sharing the bread and wine. So bear in mind, consecrating in Christian belief means to declare the bread and wine to be or to represent the body and blood of Christ. Now if you haven't watched the sacraments video, I suggest you do, and if you link this back to when we discussed women serving in the priesthood, this is why Catholics, one of the reasons why Catholics believe that women cannot serve in the priesthood, because at the point of consecration, which is when the bread and wine are declared to be the body and blood of Christ in the Catholic Church, the priest or the bishop or the deacon is standing in persona Christi, standing in as Jesus at that point. And of course, Jesus being male means that some Catholics believe that women cannot fulfill that role. The questions that I asked you here were what is meant by the liturgy of the Word. Now, of course, the liturgy of the Word are prayers that are said predominantly, well, not only, but predominantly in Orthodox churches. It is a liturgical form of worship which precedes the Holy Communion. And the way it might be helpful to Christians is that it is a structure, it is a ritual, it is something that they do time after time, every Sunday. They know exactly what they're expecting, and they know exactly what's expected of them, and it can and it helps them to gain access, again, as mentioned before, to the grace of God. Now, this sheet here, I will be linking in the description below. I'll leave it up on the screen for a second and we can have a quick look through it. There are many different ways that Christians celebrate Holy Communion, and there's 4 different ways outlined on this sheet here. Okay, so we'll have a look through the main 4 very briefly. So the Divine Liturgy in the Orthodox Church. Liturgy of the Word, there are hymns, prayers and readings from the Bible. The priest comes through the royal doors to chant the Gospel, and there may be a sermon. The Liturgy of the Faithful, the priest comes through the royal doors to receive the wine and bread baked by the members of the congregation. He then selects 1 loaf to be consecrated. The Creed, Nicene Creed, the Lord's Prayer and other prayers are offered for the church, the world and the local community. Behind the royal doors, the priest says the words Jesus said at the Last Supper. The bread is divided into 4. 3 parts are consecrated as the body and blood of Christ. The 4th, unconsecrated part, is broken into small pieces. The priest then comes through the royal doors to distribute the bread and wine together on a spoon to the people who have come forward for communion. Prayers of thanksgiving are said after communion, and as people leave, the priest gives them pieces of the unconsecrated bread to take home as a sign of being part of the Christian community. Now, this is a very, very structured setup here. Bear in mind, this is a fantastic example of liturgical worship. Very conveniently, Divine Liturgy is in the name, so that might make it easy for you to remember as an example of liturgical worship, but this is an absolutely fantastic example. Now, Catholic Mass, they have the Liturgy of the Word as well. So the Mass would begin with greetings from the priest and prayers of penance and praise. On Sundays, there are 3 readings from the Bible: the Old Testament, Paul's letters and the Gospels, a psalm and a homily. People say prayers for the church, the world, the local community, the sick and the dead. On Sundays, this is preceded by the Creed, which would of course in this case be the Apostles' Creed. As I'm sure you can see, very, very, very similar. Offerings of bread and wine are brought to the altar. The priest says the Eucharist prayer using the words that Jesus said at the Last Supper. He gave you thanks and praise. He broke the bread, gave it to his disciples and said, "Take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body, which has been given up for you." He prays over the wine using similar words. The people say the Lord's Prayer. The priest and congregation give a sign of peace to each other. Then members of the congregation come forward to receive communion. The priest blesses the people and tells them, for example, he might say, "Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your lives." The one that I remember from when I was at school was, "Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." So those are two examples there, Catholic Mass and Orthodox Mass. Very, very, very similar. I would suggest that you follow the link and download this sheet for yourself if you are doing revision, so that you can highlight the specific differences between them. Holy Communion in Anglican Church. So a communion service in the Church of England is almost identical to that of the Catholic Church. Very, very, very similar. One small difference is that peace is shared at a different time. It's really important to remember that some Anglicans share the Catholic and Orthodox view that the bread and wine are transformed into Christ's body and blood, so transubstantiation. But many believe that Jesus is present in the bread and wine in a spiritual way and only while it's being eaten. This is a particularly interesting differentiation. The Anglican Church is a very interesting example of a denomination in that it's very similar to the Catholic Church and with very, very few differences. Important to remember that, of course, it was formed because Henry VIII left the Catholic Church in order to divorce his wife, or to marry someone who had been divorced. So they do share a lot of traits, a lot of beliefs and practices that are very similar. Nonconformist churches then, now of course these are sort of a little bit less likely to be so liturgical and so ritualistic. A typical service would consist of a hymn, a prayer, a Bible reading, then another prayer for the world and for the needs of particular people. The minister reminds the congregation of Jesus' words and actions, and then it says a prayer of thanksgiving over the bread and wine, saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." There is an open table, so anyone who wishes to take communion may receive the bread and wine. And now people may come forward to receive the bread and wine. In some places the bread is cut beforehand, but in other places people break it off. It's passed around the seated congregation, and sometimes the wine would be non-alcoholic and distributed in small cups. There would be a small prayer of thanksgiving, blessing and encouragement to go out and serve God. Now, as I'm sure you can see, these are very, very similar. There's a lot of similarities between them, despite there being such divergence in other areas of belief and practice amongst Christianity. Within the Holy Communion and the sacrament of the Eucharist, there is a lot of similarity, and it functions in very similar ways, which is an interesting point to note, because with it being the most important, or often considered the most important part of a Christian's life and Christian's practice, it would make sense that there are some similarities, or major similarities, between different denominations. Hopefully that has made some of the issues surrounding Holy Communion a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to understand. Bear in mind there's a lot of information here. Don't expect you to absorb it all at once. I really would recommend that you follow the link, download this worksheet if you are creating revision notes for yourself, because there's a lot of information on here. I will also be linking a couple of videos in the description below, one of a young person talking about his first Holy Communion, and the second of something focusing more on the importance of communion for the Christian Church. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to either ask me in person, send me an email, or of course just leave a comment in the description below.